Over 300,000 people were systematically killed over the course of 4 years. Their villages were burned. Their priests were executed. Their children were marched into the desert. And today, almost no one knows their name. This is not the Armenian Genocide. This is not the Holocaust. This is a different massacre. One that happened at the same time, in the same region, carried out by the same hands. And it has been almost completely erased from the record of human history.
They called themselves Suraye, the Assyrians, a Semitic people with an unbroken history stretching back to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of civilization itself. They were among the first people on Earth to adopt Christianity in the 1st century AD, long before it became the religion of empires. By 1914, between 600,000 and 750,000 Assyrians lived scattered across the borderlands of the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and Russia. In the mountain ranges of Hakkari, the plains of Urmia, the ancient plateau of Tur Abdin. They were not a threat to anyone. They were farmers, priests, craftsmen, scholars. And that year, the world went to war. And someone decided they had to disappear. The Ottoman Empire of 1914 was a dying giant. For over a century, it had been losing territory, losing influence, losing its grip on the diverse peoples it had ruled for generations. Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Arabs, Jews, Assyrians. All of them lived within its borders under what was called the millet system, a structure that granted minority communities limited self-governance in exchange for loyalty to the Sultan. It was imperfect. It was often discriminatory, but it was a system. And for centuries, it functioned. Then came the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, the men history would call the Young Turks. They seized effective control of the Ottoman government in 1913 with a vision: Pan-Turkism, a racially and culturally homogeneous Turkish state. In that vision, there was no room for Armenians, there was no room for Greeks, and there was no room for Assyrians. The Assyrians understood what was coming before it arrived. In the Hakkari Mountains of southeastern Anatolia, their religious and political leader, Patriarch Mar Shemun 19 Benyamin, watched the political temperature rise and attempted to walk a careful line: neutrality. The Assyrians would not take sides in the coming war. They would not fight for the Russians. They would not fight against the Ottomans. They would simply survive. History would not give him that option. Because by October 1914, the Ottoman Empire had entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the leadership of the CUP, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, Jamal Pasha, the architects of what would follow, saw the chaos of global war for what it was: cover. Not for a battle, for a cleansing. What happened next was not spontaneous. That is the first thing you must understand.
The massacres that would devastate the Assyrian people were not the product of wartime panic or rogue commanders acting without orders or ethnic tensions spiraling out of control. They were organized. They were deliberate. They were policy. The Ottoman government mobilized two instruments of destruction. First, the regular army, specifically units operating on the Eastern Front, where Assyrian villages were most concentrated. Second, and more brutally, the irregular forces. Kurdish tribal militias, armed and directed by Ottoman commanders, were deployed against Assyrian settlements throughout 1914 and into 1915. Villages in Hakkari that had existed for 1,000 years were surrounded, looted, and burned. Men were killed where they stood. Women and children were marched. The Assyrians had a word for it: Seyfo. In the Assyrian language, it means simply the sword.
Simultaneously, the CUP was issuing deportation orders against the Armenian population, orders that followed almost identical administrative procedures. This was not coincidence. Researchers, including historian David Gaunt, in his landmark 2006 study, Massacres, Resistance, Protectors, documented the parallel structure of the anti-Christian campaigns, demonstrating that Ottoman authorities coordinated the destruction of multiple minority groups under unified military direction. And as the killing began, Patriarch Mar Shimun XIX Benjamin, the man who had tried to keep his people out of the war, attempted to negotiate with Kurdish chieftain Simko Shikak, one of the key military figures enabling the massacres. He traveled to meet him in person in March of 1918, carrying the hope of a ceasefire. Simko killed him at the meeting, shot him and his escort dead. After that, there was nothing left to negotiate.
The killing happened in 3 main theaters across 4 years. You need to understand the scale of each one separately, because the world has never been forced to see them together. In the Hakkari Mountains, beginning in 1914, Ottoman and Kurdish forces systematically attacked Assyrian villages. Communities that had maintained their language, their liturgy, and their way of life for 15 centuries were burned out of the mountains. The survivors fled toward Urmia in Persia, arriving as refugees in a land that would soon become its own killing ground. In the Urmia plain of northwestern Persia, Russian forces had initially provided a degree of protection to Assyrian and Armenian Christian populations. When Russia collapsed into revolution in 1917 and withdrew its troops, that protection evaporated overnight. Ottoman and Kurdish forces moved in immediately. American Presbyterian missionary Reverend William Ambrose Shedd, who had served in Urmia for decades, documented the atrocities in letters and reports that still exist in the archives of the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. He described village burnings, mass executions of clergy, and the systematic targeting of Christian communities across the plain. Shedd himself died in Urmia in 1918, having refused to abandon his congregation.
Then came what survivors would remember as simply the flight. In the summer of 1918, approximately 70,000 Assyrians, the remnants of entire communities, fled south from Urmia toward British lines in Mesopotamia. The march lasted weeks through brutal summer heat, with almost no food and no military protection. Tens of thousands died on the road, not in battle, not quickly, of exhaustion, starvation, disease,
and repeated attacks by pursuing forces. In Tur Abdin, in the ancient heartland of Syriac Christianity, massacres continued through 1918, with near total destruction of Christian villages that had stood since the Byzantine era. When historians attempt to count the dead, and the counting is itself contested because so many records were destroyed, the estimates range from 250,000 to as high as 750,000 Assyrians killed between 1914 and 1918. The middle range, accepted by most genocide scholars, represents the death of between 50 and 75% of the entire Assyrian population. 3 out of every 4 people gone.
The war ended in 1918. The killing slowed, and then the second crime began. In 1920, the victorious Allied powers signed the Treaty of Sèvres with the defeated Ottoman Empire. That treaty, on paper, promised protections and a degree of autonomy for the Assyrian people. Acknowledgement, however limited, that something had been done to them that required remedy. Assyrian representatives traveled to the Paris Peace Conference. They submitted testimony. They presented evidence. They asked simply to be recognized. They were ignored then. And then things got worse. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaced Sèvres entirely. The new Turkish Republic, consolidated under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk after a successful military campaign, negotiated from a position of strength. The Lausanne Treaty made no mention of Assyrian autonomy, no mention of the massacres, no reparations, no recognition. Every promise made at Sèvres was quietly discarded. The Assyrians received nothing. No homeland, no acknowledgement, no word.
Since then, the Turkish government has maintained an official position denying the Armenian Genocide, and by extension, any responsibility for the simultaneous destruction of Assyrian and Greek Christian communities. Western governments, prioritizing their strategic relationship with Turkey, a NATO member since 1952, have largely declined to press the issue. The United States did not formally recognize even the Armenian Genocide until 2021. As of today, the Assyrian Genocide has been officially recognized by only a small number of countries, among them Sweden, the Netherlands, and New South Wales in Australia. It is absent from the curriculum of almost every school system on Earth.
The Assyrian people today number perhaps 3 to 4 million worldwide, scattered across Iraq, Syria, the United States, Sweden, and Australia. Their homeland is gone. In the regions they once inhabited for centuries, they are now a tiny and shrinking minority. And the name Seyfo, the word they used for what was done to them, remains almost entirely unknown outside their own community.
History does not forget by accident. It forgets because someone decides that certain deaths do not need to be remembered, because some victims are useful to mourn and others are inconvenient. The Assyrian Genocide was buried because the people who carried it out won their political survival, because the nations that might have intervened had other interests, because a people scattered into diaspora without a state or an army or a seat at any table had no one powerful enough
to demand the world look at what happened to them. But the documents exist. The missionary records exist. The testimonies of survivors, collected by scholars like David Gaunt and Joseph Naayem, whose 1920 account, "Shall This Nation Die?" stands as one of the earliest genocide testimonies ever published. These exist. The question is not whether this happened. It happened. The question is why we decided it wasn't worth remembering, and what else we've decided the same about.